This is a guy, I wanted to open with this guy because street directories, does everyone know what a street directory is? You don't? Already people have forgotten. Okay. I remember street directories in Dublin. We had Tom's Directory. And it was on the go until about 1995, 1996. And it was just a list of everybody in the city, street by street. So we lived on Lower Kilmacud Road, so the name of the householder in every single house. And it had a whole load of other information at the front, which would be about government departments, sort of touristy stuff, a few maps, where the hospitals are, that kind of thing. Did nobody have that sort of stuff in Belfast, or wasn't it? Yes. Yeah. You had the Belfast and Northern Ireland Directory, and it stopped production in 1995 or 1996. So what you have now are Jeeves and all these things. When you Google online, you get something equivalent. Now the reason I put this guy up is because his name is Theophilus Moore, and he's the guy who founded Old Moore's Almanac. Does everybody know Old Moore's Almanac? Yeah. You've heard of him, right? I like to think of him as a kind of presiding spirit over the Irish Directory and Almanac. And the reason I think that is because the two big directories that I can think of are the street directories and the telephone directories. And telephone directories are pretty dull affairs. They're flat, they're just the telephone and address. You could do something with them as an academic, but they're not hugely interesting. I always found street directories, particularly old street directories, fascinating, and had an enormous amount of affection for them. And I know that once you start working on them, you'll develop a lot of affection for them too. Upstairs we have all the street directories for Belfast and Ulster from 1900 to 1995 just on our shelves in the search room, and you can just work through them. Then on our website we have all the street directories for Belfast from 1819 to 1900, and you can work through them online. Now, to tell you, the basic definition of a street directory, the simplest definition is just a list of everybody who lives in a city. And you can organize that list in different ways, and you can sometimes have you often have 2 or 3 different arrangements. You have a list by street, or you might have a list of everybody in alphabetical order. And you can have other things as well. But usually the street directories, and this is why I certainly get so fond of them, and I know you will, they usually have an enormous amount of other information that will plunge you into the day-to-day life of the people you're looking for in the particular year that you're looking for them. So you'll see so much that's going on in the city at the same time as you're looking for the person that you're trying to track down. Now, the 2 sources of street directories. In a sense, street directories began, you'll see on your list, they go way back to the 1500s. But there's very few of them until the 1800s. And there's lists of merchants, that's one source, and the other source is the astrological almanacs. And Old Moore, the almanacs start in the 1500s, and they were extremely popular, and they're lists of fairs and markets, and then loads of astrological stuff, tide tables, tables showing you the moon, phases of the moon, all that kind of stuff, mystical stuff, which stayed in directories for quite a while in small doses. So personally, because I like street directories, I like the mystical element of Theophilus Moore, who founded Old Moore's Almanac in 1765. But this is a lot less. Unfortunately, although I love street directories, they weren't quite as wonderful as the fully fledged astrological almanac. Now the directory became very popular in the 1800s, early 1800s. And by the late 1800s, by 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, they were at their peak. And they were in constant use, and they were huge things. They'd be 1,200, 1,300 pages long. Amazing things to put together. And this is a good example of your classic street directory. The title page, it was made by the Belfast newsletter, 1887. A big index with the details of every single institution in the city, and that would tell you who's running the institution, everything about them, and so an amazing depth of information. We give you a huge amount of statistical information because it was the Victorian era and self-improvement was the norm. So street directories, by the time they disappeared in the 1990s, had much less information because people were less cultured. And the Albert Memorial, the Cook statue, they loved putting this stuff in. And there was all kinds of reasons for it, apart from simply the sense that everything had to be cultured. One of the reasons would be, I mean, one of the things that the classic thing was, a street directory was made for somebody who didn't live in a city. So if you were and it would be a businessman, a commercial traveller, and if they were living in Manchester and they wanted to come across to Belfast and know their way around, they got the Belfast Street Directory and it told them all they needed to know. It would tell them where the doctors were, what the times of the markets were. It would have a detailed list of everybody in the city in different ways, in alphabetical order and on street order, so if they were delivering stuff street by street, like a lot of commercial travellers did in the 1860s, 1870s, they would be able to know exactly how many pamphlets they'd need, whatever they'd need, and what houses they could tick off, houses they'd gone to. They'd know exactly what they'd done. And they usually had maps with them so that would guide them around. They were like rough guides for commercial travellers. And of course, one of the things you would need is knowledge of the city. And this was the sort of knowledge people felt they needed. They'd come, they'd meet, they'd have a cultured conversation, and then they'd start business. But like any business transaction, if you don't have any knowledge, it quickly alienates the people you're trying to deal with. So the more knowledge of the place you have, the better it's going to work. So these directories had loads of knowledge, loads of information. This is the kind of stuff, these are a list of the joint stock companies in Belfast in 1887. These are the Belfast markets, public halls and rooms, where you can get newspapers. If you want to read the local newspapers, there'll be special rooms. Call straight to those rooms and you get all the local newspapers. All the stuff a commercial traveller needs. Transport, carriages and coaches. Now, this is the street. This is the typical kind of thing. In alphabetical order, Aberdeen Street, Abingdon Terrace, Abyssinia Street, Academy Court. Everybody living on these streets. The name of the householder. Obviously it would just give the name of the householder, or the apparent name of the householder. I know I used to be really pleased because Tom's Directory, and this is of course something you always got to be aware of, because this was an enormous project, and they had to by the 1860s, they were doing them every single year, and they had to revise them every year. So it wasn't hard to make mistakes. And although they were passionate in the way that only Victorians were about getting their details right, they obviously made mistakes. So you have to always bear that in mind. And so if you get an 1860 directory, check the 1861, 1862, cross-check stuff to see if mistakes have crept in. But my dad's name was never on the Tom's Directory for our house, it was my name. So I used to take delight in the error that used to occur in Tom's Directory in the 1990s. Now, by that stage, 1887, they covered the city, but they also covered the suburbs and all the principal residents of the suburbs. This is Strandtown, they'd also have Hollywood, all these places. And then they also would, and this goes way back, they would have a list of the major, you can arrange your information in several ways. You can have a list of people, everybody in every street, and look at each street, and that's very, very useful. Or you can decide, right, I want to see the number of engineers in Belfast, and I just want a list of the number of engineers, or the number of engravers, or the number of immigration agents, or dyers. And so they always had a big list of, under the different names of the profession, that would be the heading, and they'd have a list of who belonged to that profession in the city at any one time. Now, this is why I gave you a handout. It doesn't come out very well. But has everybody got a handout now? Everyone's got a handout, great. Okay, well, the very first one goes back to the 1530s. Then there's the almanacs. And the almanacs were very, very popular in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. They're still popular, but in the 18th and 19th century, you'd get, in Ireland, you used to get sales of 300,000 to 400,000. And that would be 300,000 to 400,000 households would get them. So people got used to buying these things every year. And there was one for Belfast, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. And the one for Belfast was by a guy called Joseph Smith, and he was the first guy to do a street directory. Anyway, the first street directory in Belfast was printed in 1807. And I thought, gosh, that's very late. Until I started looking up the history. And I realised that the first directory for London was 1677. The first printed directory. There was nothing in London until the 1730s after that. And then from the 1730s, 1740 on, you got one printed every year or every 2 years. So you got a regular one in London. The first Dublin directory was in 1751. And these directories were quite unsophisticated and quite simple. They're very useful still for us, but they weren't as elaborate as the kind of directory that I've shown you there a minute ago. So 1751, the first Dublin directory. The first directory outside Dublin was Limerick. And you'll see it in 1769, John Ferrer. So all this time, Belfast wasn't publishing a directory. Again, the first Amsterdam directory was in 1771. So even a place as big as Amsterdam didn't publish a directory till then. So it's not too much of a disgrace for Belfast not to have one at that stage. Edinburgh got one in 1774, and Cork in 1787. So you kind of get a rough idea of these things. Now the English directories, they started making huge directories trying to cover all of the British Isles in the 1790s. And that's, you'll get the Universal British Directory in 1790, 1798. And that tried to include Belfast, Dublin, Galway, and other cities. So you can go back to those to try and get some information on those directories. The particular guys who put that together, most of the guys who made these directories were printers and engravers. And it was a kind of a sideline. And they would get subscribers to put together a directory, and they would run them up with varying degrees of honesty and probity. Printers and publishers in the 18th and 18th century especially, were chancers, quite a lot of them. And they pirated as many books as they could, and they would copy stuff, plagiarize stuff, and run it up and just get rid of it as quick as possible. So, as it happens, the very first major British directory in 1790, Barfoot and Wilkes. Wilkes was a scoundrel, and he plagiarized an enormous amount of stuff. So the only thing is that because he was a good plagiarist, he copied stuff that was quite well done. So it's quite useful still. However, he got prosecuted quite a few times, and he ended up in jail a few times. The first really good directory is 1799 by Holden, William Holden and Thomas Underhill. Holden was a coal merchant, and he thought he could make more money as running these directories. Now these are massive directories, and they tried to include a few Irish towns. And Belfast appears in them. Not an awful lot out of Belfast, but a little bit. Now, the first directory from Belfast, I was just kind of like, was in a sense the Belfast Almanac came out in 1803. And that's not on the list there, but I'm going to discuss it in a minute. You get the first Belfast directory in 1806, Joseph Smith, and then you get a whole load of other directories. You get nothing 1806, 1807, and then you get something in 1819 from Belfast. You get Pigot's directory, which we have upstairs, in the 1820s, 1822 and 1824. And these are all trade directories, but they include a lot of stuff, a lot of residential people as well. So they began to, from the 1860s, 1760s, 1770s, it started off just as a list of merchants, and then it became a list of the principal inhabitants, and then it became a list of as many residents as they could fit in. The paradox was that you started off making directories for tourists, for visiting commercial travellers, but very quickly the local inhabitants became very proud of these directories. And if there was a directory published for Belfast, for instance, and your name wasn't in it, well, you'd get a bit irritated. So the next edition, you wanted your name in it. So like a lot of things, and I think it's particularly, you sometimes begin to wonder, were the directories being made for outsiders or for locals? And the more they were made for locals, the more accurate they got. And as soon as people were published, you wanted to have a look and see were you in them. And so that's all, it's perfect for us because it means they're more complete and more comprehensive. But it's quite entertaining when you see the complaints about not being in them. And obviously, if you have a big list of resident gentry, and you think of yourself as a resident gentleman and your name isn't in it, you'd be very cross. And of course, lots of people made sure their names were in the next editions. So it just made them better and better as they went along. Now, the second page, just the major directories, part 2, which is a little bit easier to read. You get a few, the watering places of Great Britain, which is a special directory of kind of resorts. Then you get the Dublin Almanac, which was the Dublin Almanac and Tom's Irish Almanac. They were basically the Dublin directories. And although they were focused on Dublin, they included an awful lot of material relating to Ulster. So they're, and all over Ireland. So it's very useful directories. Then you had Slater's New City Pictorial Directory, which is the only illustrated directory. Unfortunately, Belfast never had an illustrated directory. And then Bassett's Directory. And you'll probably have seen Bassett's Directory in their reprints. We have them upstairs as well. Now, the next thing, and this is another reason why you can kind of like, I'm going to bring you through them very quickly, but you'll see at the start, the top one is Joseph Smith and the Belfast Almanac. The same Joseph Smith produced stuff. See, it's very useful. This is a list of all the Belfast and Ulster directories from 1803, when they start, until about 1912. And that was hard to produce, because it's not easy to get all that information. But you need to know it, because I know I never had a clear idea of exactly what years there was a directory in existence and what years they weren't in existence. So, because often you would think, you'd sort of see a reference in a book and you'd say, Bradshaw's Directory 1820 for Newry. And you'd think, well, maybe it was there in 1821, 22. But no. It was just published for 1820, and there's nothing after that until the next Newry directory, which might have been 30 years later. So this will give you a list of all the directories that exist. We don't have them all in PRONI, but we have a lot of them in PRONI. And they're all worth bearing in mind. Now, you'll see that's the date of publication, that's the title, that's the publisher, and this is the size. I tended to put in the size because you can get an idea. They start off very skinny little things, 40 pages. By the end of the century, they're 1,000, 1,200 pages. So you can get an idea of how much information that's in them. And then, initially they're all just Belfast. And it just tells you who's in Belfast. But by the 1820s, in fact by earlier, by 1816, in Holden's annual directory, they start taking other towns in Ulster. And I included those so that you get a clear idea of what towns were included and what towns weren't included in each directory. Now, the first, Joseph Smith was the first directory. And now you've got this in your hands, so I can move on. I can move on and just show you the nature of the directories. This is the way, this is from the first Dublin directory in 1751. And all it consisted of was a list of the people in Dublin. It's a select list, not everybody included, and just in alphabetical order. And that's the way nearly all directories were until the 1790s and early 1800s. Very simple lists. Now, that's convenient in some ways, in that you can just, if you've got a name in your head, you can just go straight to Hale or Halfpen or Halpany or something and just see it there. Bearing in mind always that there could be 10 different versions of any particular surname. So you can just scan the whole thing and looking for different versions of a surname. But that's the way nearly all directories were until the 1800s. That's a map that came out in 1778 called Taylor and Skinner, which lists all the gentlemen's seats all over Ireland, and it's of limited use, but it's kind of in between a directory and a map. This is to celebrate the Belfast Almanac. Joseph Smith produced these almanacs from 1803 on, and they continue to exist from 1803, I think, until the 1920s or 1930s. They had lists of fairs and loads of tide tables and moon tables, all that sort of stuff, and loads of astrological material. But they also had, from about 1803, 1804, from very early on, they had lists of the major institutions, who were the schoolmasters, the doctors, who was running the market, stuff like that in Belfast. So it's not a great use, but it's of limited use, but it's still a lot better than nothing. And as it happens, he was the first guy to start a directory in Belfast, because he got a bit of practice doing the almanac, and then he switched it and essentially expanded the almanac, while he continued to produce the pure almanac. Now, the almanacs are kind of interesting. The astrological side of them are very interesting. There's almanacs in England and almanacs in Ireland. In England, the astrology died out very quickly. In Ireland, there was astrology. I thought it was quite interesting looking thing. The Belfast Almanac had quite a bit of astrology until the 1820s, and after that it didn't have any. The almanacs like Moore's Almanac and Nugent's Almanac, which are the two big almanacs for the rest of the country, had a lot of astrology right up until the 1900s. And they tended to predict things like the downfall of the landlords once Saturn was in conjunction with Venus and stuff like that. So they had very peculiar, they were looking out for particular things to happen, and that rents would go down because of an eclipse and stuff like that. So people were cheered up reading that stuff. But it's interesting that, I suppose, in largely Protestant Ulster, the astrological side disappeared much more quickly. Whereas the other almanacs sold particularly in Leinster and Connacht and North Munster, and the astrology stayed important for a long time. So it was curious. Anyway, this is the title page of Joseph Smith's first Belfast Directory. Now we have this upstairs, and it's very simple, a small little thing. It's only about, it gives the number of pages there. It's only about 30 pages. A basic list of people in it, with the name of the person by surname, his occupation, and his address. And very, very useful and a great start. The second one, the first one was in 1807, the second one was in 1808. A select list of people living in Belfast, and combined with a list of the principal officers in carrying out various duties and functions in Belfast. So you have the fire engines, and who has the keys of the house for the fire engine, the excise man, the dispensary and fever hospital, who were the clergymen and who were the doctors, that sort of stuff. It's all very, very useful. The first serious directory, and we have this online, was Bradshaw's directory in 1819. And this is a lot bigger, and that's just the title page of that. Immediately they're including a history of Belfast and its institutions. They've got some stuff on Lisburn. They've got a map of Belfast. And as it happens, they've got a kind of a tourist's guide to the Giant's Causeway at the end of it. So it's everything a commercial traveller would need. The next important directory, there's Belfast Directories in 1831-32, 1835, 1839, and they're all very useful. But the basic layout is a list of everybody in the town by surname, alphabetical list, and then a list of the tradesmen under different headings. So So you'll get woolen drapers, a list of who is a woolen draper in Belfast, engravers, all that kind of thing. So you kind of see that's the way it was until about 1840. And then this was a groundbreaking one. You see I've got it right. Because Matthew Martin, an accountant, who started that directory, he started the idea in Belfast of doing a street directory. And you can see there Adelaide Place, Albion Place, Alfred Street, Ann Street. And he just lists, according to the house number, the name of the householder. And that is a very interesting addition. And then he has the same thing, grocers and tea dealers, public notaries, brokers, and in Belfast terms, very interesting, consuls of foreign powers. From the 1830s, because Belfast had such enormous international exchange and international trade, it had quite a few consuls. Dealing with all the various countries that Belfast was trading with, the major countries. So it's a lot of interest. The other thing, and it's one of the joys of street directories, and I thought I'd throw this in because it's so dry otherwise, is the ads. All the street directories had a fantastic selection of ads because advertising was one of the ways that the printers paid for the publication. The publishers paid for it. They got subscribers, they often got the people who were going into it to pay a little sixpence to make sure you were in the directory. Because again, if you were a linen draper, you wanted your name in that directory because some guy in Manchester was going to get the Belfast Directory and he wanted to have dealings with merchants in Belfast, some guy in Manchester, and he wanted to be sure that your name was in the list. So the publisher was able to sort of like put a little bit of pressure on you to pay sixpence or a shilling towards making sure your name was on the list. But also, of course, when you arrived in Belfast, you needed to know where to get some food. So Grant's Confectionery, Donegal Street, Pastry Pie and Cookery Tavern, tea and coffee, hot rolls, cold meat, hot beef or mutton steak, biscuits, custards, soups, drinks, every kind of drink, fantastic stuff actually. Also circulating library, and I stuck that in because the same guy who published the directories had his own circulating library and he gave lists of books you could buy. Sportsmen, shooting game, immigration agents, stationers, and a hat warehouse. So you get an enormous amount of good stuff in this. And they're beautiful stuff, and it is one of the joys of directories. And all this is up online. It also tells you exactly, if you've got an ancestor that you track down in 1841 in this directory, you can see what his life, you can get a taste of what his life was like by looking at the ads. Because often when you start genealogy, you're just thinking of births and deaths, you're thinking of names. But in many ways, these things only take on meaning when you actually realize the context. What was it like in that town? You look at the street where people were living. You find somebody, you find he was in Hercules Street. You look at everybody else on the street and you see they were all butchers. And you get an idea of what kind of a street it was. And that really gives meaning to the search for family roots. So there's all the hats that were on the go in 1841. One of the next big ones was Henderson's in 1846. And I'm showing you this. These are all online. And you can browse the website. And I'll bring you into that in a few minutes. Now Henderson made his street directory just a little bit easier to read. In the process, he got rid of some streets. And I'll go into that in a minute, which is unfortunate. But it does look nice. So again, you can see with these, we can give you there's Commercial Court, off Donegal Street, James Hart, muslin manufacturer, number 9 Commercial Court. James Kennedy and Son, flax spinning mills, Millvale, Falls Road. So actually, in this case, it gives his offices and it gives where he actually was his main place of business. It's his offices and habitation. So you get a lot of incidental stuff. Again, it's got a list of plumbers, rope and twine makers, saddlers and harness makers, all that kind of stuff. Also great ads. A suit of mourning if you have to go to a funeral and you never know. You can get a suit of mourning and you have to go in the right way. You can get a mourning suit done in, you can have the whole thing done in 5 minutes and measured in 5 minutes and ready for you in 5 hours. And they cut you up, it looks like the pieces of a cow on a butcher's diagram, but you can see it, it's very self-measurement. So you can even measure it yourself and come straight into the guy and have it all done in 5 minutes. That's what the houses look like in the middle of Belfast. That's on High Street. So it's amazing. I mean, it's like time traveling. Again, that's what the people look like walking around. And if you get an ancestor in 1846, he probably looked something like that. Well, if he was of a certain class, at least. Steamers and where to go all over the British Isles. Parlour novelist. Now, so those are the kind of directories that you get. And all of these are online, and I'm going to show you what they're like and how to get into them in a few minutes. One of the interesting things is, during the 18th century, there was no directory in Belfast. And the first one appeared effectively 1803, but properly in 1806. Now, one of the reasons, I think, partly directories Belfast grew enormously in the 1780s, 1790s, 1800s. So suddenly it desperately needed trade directories by the early 1800s. That's one reason. But one of the other reasons is the Belfast newsletter, which is one of the oldest continuously published papers in the world, was an amazingly, was a very successful broadsheet in the 18th century. And people used the newsletter instead. So when I was looking at the directories, often the big newspapers started producing the directories. But in Belfast, the newsletter just ignored directories until suddenly, in 1852, it decided to start. And you'll see in your big list of directories, if you go to 1852, that's when the first edition of the Belfast and Province of Ulster Directory appears. And it is the major directory by James Alex Henderson. And the Henderson family specialised in directories in Belfast. And the Belfast newsletter specialised in directories right up until the 1990s. And from then on, you get your classic Belfast directory. And they're massive things. You can see the first one in 1852. I don't have a list. Okay, well, there were about 700 pages. And by 1884, there were 1,000 pages. They were very efficient at publishing. Only a big newspaper with the sort of printing apparatus could manage the enormity of a task like that. They were really huge things by the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s. So this is one, it's a typical title page. It happens to be 1884, and it's the Belfast thing. And that's an ad for 1884, and that's actually Newry because they were being sold all over Ulster at that stage. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit. And now the Belfast Directory, it continued until about 1995. More or less the same format. We've got them all online until 1900. And after 1900, we have them all upstairs. And it's the same thing, there's lists of everybody in every street, which is an amazing plum pudding of information, and also an alphabetical list, and then a list by profession and trade. And then a huge amount, a big plum pudding of other information that you'll find, when you're working through it, you'll find will sort of stimulate you enormously. Now, they continued, it's quite interesting, I just noticed a lot of things. I'd say the heyday, the biggest directories were in the 1910 to 1920 period. They continued, the title didn't change. When partition occurred in 1922, I was just interested to see that they continued to call it the Province of Ulster Directory. It didn't change the name, it became the Northern Ireland Directory, the Belfast and Northern Ireland Directories in 1960-61. But in 1922, up until 1922, they had the towns for all over the 9 counties. After 1922, they just had the towns for the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. So they just kind of stripped down and became a slightly different entity. They stayed more or less the same shape with loads of ads until the 1960s. After the 1960s, you can see that the ads become less important and they become more like handbooks. Do you know, like the kind of gazetteers, like the administration handbooks? They were very, very popular and very useful, but they were funded in a different way. The Belfast newsletter continued to publish them. After the 1980, they stopped having occupations, and they just had the names of people. Up until 1980, they always had the name of a person. You go to a street, you get the name of the person in each, who is the head of the household in each house, and you'd have the occupation. And that would go for it could be a labourer, or it could be a bank manager. They would always have the occupation. After 1980, they stopped doing that. And they just got more and more simple until 1995, when they abandoned them completely. So, and that's when, I suppose, the internet, it's a sign that the internet was beginning to take off in 1995-96, where the competition from the internet wasn't making it worthwhile. And so that's an indication. Now, Bassett's directory was one of the big directories for all of Ulster in the, they tended to take particular counties. And there's the County Down, County Armagh, and County Antrim directory that George Henry Bassett did. And he did these in 1886. And they're wonderful things, and you get an enormous amount of kind of pleasure out of them, and an enormous amount of information out of them also. The typical, this is the County Down one, the Newry ads. Now, I did a little bit of analysis of these directories, and all this is on the handbook, or on the handout. So if you go, and it's not just academic, because I noticed a few things that you need to know when you're going through these directories. First, I decided to see, obviously there was a directory in 1807, and it had a certain number of people in the directory. And I wanted to see what proportion of the population was included in the directory, because that's going to give you an idea of how useful they are. So you can see in 1807, there was an alphabetical list, 635 people, there was about 4,800 households, and this is approximate according to the number of houses in Belfast at the time. So 13% of the households. So about 87% of the householders in Belfast weren't included. That's worth, you have to bear that in mind. So there's a lot that weren't included. But you can see how, as the directories are published, and as it gets later into the 19th century, more and more of the householders are included. So in the 1819 directory, which is online, you get, there's 2,500 people listed, and there's about 5,900 households in the city. This is very crude now, but it's a useful thing. So 44% of the householders in 1819 are included. And that's actually quite an amazing proportion by that stage. And if you're thinking about the reliability and the accuracy, one of the good things about being a relatively small town is that everybody knew if there was mistakes, and the publishers got lacerated if there were mistakes. So there was a kind of a built-in element, where kind of self-critical element to ensure accuracy. So I think there was reasonable accuracy, and geographers who've done analyses of directories in England and Wales have found a sort of a 70 to 80% accuracy in England and Wales, and I'd say it's slightly higher in Belfast. Now, you can see how up to 1839, in 1839 there was 4,790 surnames listed, and 11,000, so it stayed at about 40 to 44% of the households in Belfast were being covered. Now something interesting happens after 1841. I told you that in 1841, and this is kind of dry, so hopefully the handout will help to keep this in your head. But each directory has a list an alphabetical list of everybody living in the city, and then it's got a list of all the streets in the city and everybody living in each street. And I never thought about this too much. And then of course it's got a list of all the butchers, bakers, merchants, ship owners, and under each heading the number of people, the number of bakers, the number of grocers, that sort of thing. And so there's the three basic categories in which they kind of listed them. Now from 1841, Martin's Directory, that's the first Belfast directory that has a list by street. And I never thought about it much. I kind of thought, well, if you're looking somebody up, you can look at the surnames, or you can look at the streets, but they'll be more or less the same. But I was completely wrong, because I tested it, and I decided to just make a quick list, and it all was wrong. And I discovered that, you can see there, on your thing, you'll see this second thing is that for all the directories, it gives you the number of persons on the street list. Now I did this, it's a little bit crude. I just worked out an average, and I multiplied by the number of pages. But it's pretty reliable. And you can work out the number of persons, but there's always a considerable number of persons on the street list that are not on the surname list. And that's something you have to bear in mind. So if it's not on a surname list, it could be on the street list. And that's where our online stuff becomes incredibly useful. Because we have all these directories online, scanned in and digitized. So if you got the hardback, and we have the hardbacks upstairs too, and they have their purpose. But if you get the hardback book, and you're the person you're looking for, if his name isn't on the surname list, he might be on the street list. But you'd have to go through every street slowly trying to find it, which would be excruciating. So the first thing to remember is, if he's not on the surname list, he could be on the street list. So all is not lost. But the second thing to remember is, you don't have to go through it by hand. You can go onto the PRONI website and you can use our digital facility and find it. Because if your name is John Grant, the guy's name, he's not on the surname list, stick John Grant in and it'll pick it out in the street list. So it balances. It means that the online digital directory is an amazing tool. Now, I tend to work with both, and I think they complement each other. I think if you come in here, you have the street directory, and you work on the online thing, and you do both together, that is the best possible way to use them. However, if you're at home, you can use the digital facility. But here in the search room, and I want to get you into the search room, but it's also true, you can have a look at both, and you'll find that they work best together, and they work very well together. Now, as we get later and later, up to 1912, you can see, and it's extremely interesting, you can see that by the 1870s, I've separated, this is the proportion of households listed on the alphabetical lists. And it goes up, it does keep rising to 48%, 50%, 60%, 70%. But if you go by the streets, it goes up to 96%, 122%, I'll explain that in a minute, 90%, 112, 130%. So there's even more people on the streets than live in Belfast. Now, what it really means is that by the 1880s, 1870s, a huge proportion, almost everybody living in Belfast is in the street directories. So they're as good as telephone directories by that stage, but they're much more interesting. And they'll give you the name of the person, the occupation, all that kind of thing. And you can go from year to year and see where they move to, and year by year. And you can often, because often a very common thing is people got married, they might have stayed in the same house that their parents were in, and a couple of years later you see the name of the new couple as the head of the house. And essentially the old couple become lodgers in their own house. Maybe people have had experience of that here already, I don't know. But you can see all these kind of changes year by year. And it makes an amazing when you have it done year by year, you can have a fantastic profile of changes in the population. Now, I said I'd explain why it's 122%, 112 and 130%. Now, the reason for that is because, essentially, I've worked out the number of households by the number of houses. But of course, the truth is, you might have 50,000 houses in Belfast, but a lot of the houses could have been tenements, and you could have had 3 or 4 families living in them. So obviously, the number of names could be greater. And by the 1880s, you can go to a particular number on a street, and you might get 4 or 5 households listed under that number. So that's why you get 130%. So probably at no time do you get every single household listed in the directories. What you're going to get by the 1880s and 1890s, my guess is you could have 80 to 90% of the households in the city listed. So you have to bear that in mind. You know, it's a slight difference, but it's an amazing resource. I mean, this is, you know, 130, 140 years ago, and you can zone in right on those directories and see exactly who's living. It's almost as good as a census. You know, that's how good it is. That's the focus and the detail that you're going to get. So that's why I did that, and that's why I hope it will be interesting. Now, I'm going to go back and I'm going to escape. And you might want to escape in a minute. I don't know if you can take much more. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to show you the right. I'm going to go into the PRONI website, Public Record Office, Northern Ireland. Right. Welcome to PRONI. Full size. Now, you'll see there the street directories. This is a list of all the directories. Now, on your handout, you'll have a list of all the directories that exist, which you need to have. Bear that in mind, because it would have been an impossible task for us to scan everything in. But you'll know with that handout that there's more directories to look for particular years. And you'll also know that there's specialised directories for Londonderry, for Armagh, for County Down, for Antrim. So that'll help you enormously. But this is a list of the directories that we've got scanned. Now, you click on the old search the street directories. And the first thing to remember is if you just go, say, I'm going to pick 1819. You just click on search, and it'll show it through like this. You'll get, first of all, it'll kind of go page by page, and I'll just show you how that is. But this will give you, it'll break down the classifications within the directory. So you can kind of go to the alphabetical side, and then that'll go straight into that aspect of it. And if you go to the next, see this is 1819, and there's your alphabetical list. And you can go page by page, all along the alphabetical list. So that's incredibly useful. Now I'm going to go back. You can go to the professions and trades. In there, and that's your trade directory. Hang on, and it looks very similar. It's merchants and traders. So it broke it down into merchants and traders that year. Now I'm going to go back, and I just want to see the whole thing. I want to start at the beginning of the directory and just read the directory. So I don't put in, I'm going to show you in a minute what it would be like to search for a particular person. I just put in Bradshaw, I just pick Bradshaw 1819, and I go straight into this, and I get the first page. And I just move through the pages. There's the 1819, and I just read it like a book. And that'll tell me everything. I should just move that. Everything that I was talking about, the historical account, information about trade, the government, the Chamber of Commerce, the White Linen Hall, all that kind of stuff in the index. Historical account of the town of Belfast. This will bring you right into, you see, one of the things, say you find out that your ancestor was a ship chandler. Well then suddenly, you're going to find out an awful lot more about him by looking at who are the ship owners. And you're going to see, where did he live in Belfast? Was he near the quays? Who would he have been dealing with? All this kind of stuff suddenly becomes, it's basically all in this directory. You're going to be able to see, the ship chandler would have been dealing, at the back of this directory is a list of all the ship captains and the ships that were registered in Belfast. These are the guys he would have been dealing with. This is the kind of contextual kind of illumination that you get from directories. I mean, it's a lot more than just a name. Now, the government of the town, so you can see how you can kind of go through it that way. And this is the first, say you had the Joseph Smith's directory in 1807 and 1808, and then Thomas Bradshaw's directory in 1819. And this is probably the first sizable directory. I think it's about 110 pages or something. I can't remember. You'll see on the list, and it'll give you a list, different things that were going on in Belfast, and all that kind of thing. So I'm going to go back, and I mean, it's pretty straightforward, and it works very well. Now, I'm going to just put in ADAMS, Adams. So you're looking for someone called Adams. Well, hang on, what's going on here? Sorry, I did ADAMS, and now I pick the directory. I go, what's their name? And then it'll immediately start, it's moving this because, say, you can see the cursor. When you put the cursor over it, it enlarges it. And these things can be a little bit twitchy, but if you do it a few times, you get used to it. And, you know, it can be very useful once you get practiced. So you're immediately into William Adams, huckster, 29 Hill Street, Nathaniel, bricklayer, Cooper, tailor, shoemaker, and then Mary Adams, no occupation given, and Charles Adams, Cooper. So you're going to get exactly where they lived, and you're going to get their occupation. And so immediately you've got a fantastic amount of information. So it's very straightforward, you know, and it'll bring you through it this way as well, where under boot and shoemakers, there's Adams, John Adams, 26 John Street and 89 Grattan Street. So these are all the different, under Adams, you can see the number of different places where the name Adams occurs. 13 grades low. And as you can see, although you can use your list of surnames, but under the other headings, you're going to get other people who aren't included in the list of surnames. Now, that happens in all the directories right up until the 1920s and 1930s. And I suspect that this was part, my own guess, is that this was part of the way, that there was some financial reason why this was happening. It could have been just simply the difficulties in putting the whole thing together and making it internally consistent. But I suspect that if you were paying a little bit of money, you got your name under the headings. And if you weren't, you just got your name under the surnames. Because if you were a visiting commercial traveller and you were in Belfast for 2 weeks and you suddenly needed a morning suit, you quickly look up tailors and drapers and get it. get a name of somebody, look to see who's the nearest guy, and go straight there. And that's what they were used for. So that, I think, is one of the reasons. So that's basically, I'm going to go back. You could, then I'm going to put Adams, and I'm going to pick, just as another example, Henderson, 1852. And you get exactly the same thing, except later and later in the century, the whole thing is more sophisticated. So there you are, a lot more Adamses. And again, the later in the century, the more you know that there's a big likelihood that almost everybody's included. So I think I'll leave it at that.